What is the difference between dialogue and dialogue? I am American, and I always thought the difference between dialogue and dialogue was one of meaning, the way Merriam-Webster has them listed. 2 entries found: dialogue, noun, dialog box, noun. According to Merriam-Webster, dialogue means conversation, and dialog box means a window on a computer screen. This is how I use / spell them. However, at least some people see them as differences between British English and American English. So my questions, I guess, are: first of all, is my understanding and Merriam-Webster's definition correct? Is dialogue used with any frequency by Americans to mean conversation? Is dialogue not used in British English for the window on a computer screen? Is there any other difference I'm not aware of, or perhaps a better explanation for the 2 versions?
The only real justification for seeing dialogue as American is that there are many words where a spelling seems more logical than British, largely thanks to Webster, though so far as I know he never addressed this particular issue. Paraphrasing Grammarist.com's entry on another such word, all early editions of Noah Webster's dictionary list catalog, but by the 1890s catalog was commonplace in AIM texts. Webster often gets credit for changes he played no direct part in. There aren't many written instances of dialogue prior its rapid uptake by software-oriented writers, but here's one from 1910 Transactions and Proceedings of the American Philological Association, where one might reasonably suppose the author to be perfectly literate. I think it's just that on average people involved in technical writing are more inclined to ignore precedent and go for what seems to them the logical spelling. Consequently, we see the short form much more often in computer contexts such as dialog box, leading many people to suppose there are in fact 2 different words involved, or at least, that the word has 2 different spellings dependent on context. It seems to me usage is currently in a transition phase, but most likely the shorter form will continue to encroach further into traditional, non-computer contexts, and will eventually be seen as standard for all contexts. But for most people, particularly Brits, this hasn't happened yet.
I was surprised to discover that Americans do indeed use the dialogue spelling when talking about a conversation. Using the American English corpus, I search for a dialogue with here because that's a word sequence that would only be used in the sense of a conversation with, and won't match dialog box. The graph for the British English corpus is very similar in appearance. Historical data isn't very useful for a new concept like a dialog box. What we see for 2000 is dialog box. American 0.00240%. British 0.00045%. Dialog box. American negligible. British 0.00050%. British people do use dialogue, but usually it's when they're making concessions to American readers. For what it's worth, my British spell checker doesn't recognize dialogue at all.
OxfordDictionaries.com has a page on British and American spelling, where it has this note: the distinctions here are not hard and fast. The spelling analog is acceptable but not very common in American English. Catalog has become the norm, but catalog is not uncommon. Dialogue is still preferred over dialogue. Searching for dialogue versus dialogue in Coca bears this out. Dialogue appears in print almost 18 times more frequently as texts than dialogue. The unabridged version of Merriam-Webster simply lists dialogue and dialogue as being variants of each other. I have seen both dialog box and dialog box used in user interface specifications. I suspect that dialogue is favored in both specifications and, especially, code simply because it's a couple of characters shorter. As you might suspect, UK texts do use dialog box when referring to dialog boxes. Also note that ZDNet UK has a tech podcast that's called Dialog Box.
As one of the people who named the Dialog Box video podcast and a programmer and writer for 30 years, I'd like to confirm the thinking that went into it. As far as we were concerned, dialogue, like program, was AIM usage for dialogue, like program, in BRI. The main UK usage for the AIM spellings was innate, which had for a long time been dominated by US software, Windows, C, Unix, Pascal et al., as their spellings were commonplace in the literature, and encoded in the grammar and syntax of programming languages and operating systems. They were used, in this context, to the practical exclusion of Brie alternatives and had been, since some point in the 70s. So, dialog box would be the correct use, as there was no example of the phrase outside it. However, there were two of us in the videos and we were British, and there was going to be an element of interaction with viewers, readers, users, although that never transpired. So we decided to go with what we considered a mild neologism.
To your title question, there is no semantic difference between dialogue and dialogue, they both mean a conversation. Specifically with dialog box versus dialog box, the latter is very rare. To your specific questions. Yes, MW's definition is correct. Yes, Americans use dialogue to mean conversation. Dialogue seems to be more formal. Dialog box seems to be by far the most common spelling in British English. See a questionable n-gram. An explanation of the pair is a bit more involved. The log ending, coming from the Greek root for speech, is the source for a handful of English words: analog, catalog, dialogue, epilogue, monologue, prologue, travelogue, plus a number of much less frequent terms. I have given these their most common current spelling in AIM, all used to be spelled with log. Just like other creations from Latin and Greek, difficult or unspoken spellings in English have been simplified over the years, e.g. anesthesia-anesthesia. Depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on, the simplification is sometimes used and sometimes not. In AIM, log seem to be in the middle of that process for some, dialogue, catalog, and not at all for others, monologue. And for some modern coinages, even in Brie where log is more common, it is spelled much more commonly dialog box.
If you want to support the channel, please consider liking and subscribing.